Okay, now that we're recording, I'd like to call to order the sort of third and final meeting of the ad hoc governance manual ad hoc committee. Sorry, got that backwards. Just as a reminder, we're sort of at the end of the process. This is the third and final. We're sort of doing final edits and cleanup of the three items that we've talked about over the course of the last two meetings. If I could have the next slide. The timeline is such that we're going to get these edits all done today with all of us, and then get the edits out to folks for review tomorrow is the intention, so that we can have a comment period and people can circulate amongst the folks that they need to. And then the idea is then it goes to the gets published on the 30th ahead of the board meeting that we have on the 8th of February. The three items that we're talking about is the advisory board governance item, the additional data points item that we talked about in our first meeting, and then the other edits that we talked about last time in terms of cleanup and just sort of making sure that everything lines up appropriately in the governance manual. So with that, if I could have the next slide. Timeline, here we are. So again, you'll have the language to review tomorrow. On the 30th, we'll send out the final edited version for folks to digest in advance of the meeting on the 8th of February. And if there's no objection from folks, let's just leap into the first of the items that we want to talk about. It's the advisory board section that we talked about earlier. In the changes, as you'll see on the slide, are sort of adjusting the quorum. That was a long topic of conversation. Align the language of the responsibilities to better comport with the education code. Clarifying times that when advisory board members are sort of making suggestion as opposed to formal recommendations, the process for bringing forward those recommendations, and then the selection process around the community engagement advisory board and the data and tools advisory boards, and trying to make that language in and of itself consistent and reliable in those issues. If we want, I think our option is to call up the document and have it done on live edit. Have I missed anything yet?
Just to clarify that final item number 4 is actually the process by which each advisory board brings forward formal recommendations.
Oh, that's right. Yes, thank you very much.
So these recommendations came from advisory board members themselves. And what they were doing is they were helping to clarify what they thought made sense for them to be bringing forward as sort of the topics in which they would bring forward suggestions. So if for those of you who were involved in the planning process, there was a real desire to make sure that there was community voice that would be bringing forward ideas to the governing board, but that didn't mean that we wanted like a wide open area, like that there were areas where community input would be particularly important for the functioning of the data system as envisioned during the planning process. So specifically, the Community Engagement Advisory Board was really focusing themselves on the idea of editing the framework that the office uses when engaging members of the broader community. Whereas the Data and Tools Advisory Board actually have 3 domains in which they might be offering formal recommendations as opposed to just suggestions. And those are, if there are additional P20 data points that should be suggested, the process by which people can request data for research purposes. So one of the things I want to flag right now for our discussion is that in the meeting that we had earlier, Gavin and I got crosswise of each other because he was talking about the process of adding data points. No, I was talking about the process of adding data points. He was talking about the process of requesting information if you were a researcher. So we just have to be really careful with that language, right? Because it's easy to confuse the two. So we might want to do a little bit clarifying there. And then finally, this group can recommend tools like such as dashboards and operational tools. And these items actually come out of statute. So they weren't just ideas that the advisory board members came up with, but they were really going back to what AB 132 said to look at the clarity for that. And the reason I'm providing this background information is that unfortunately the advisory board member who is going to come and do this presentation for you had a last minute conflict. So having facilitated that meeting, I just want to share a little bit of what came out of it. Anything else you want to add, Gavin, before I switch over to the live view of the
No, but I want to take an opportunity because of the conflict issue with your forbearance committee members. There is one thing that potentially will make me step away for about 2 or 3 minutes. If that's the case, I will hand the gavel over to Robert to continue the meeting process. But just wanted to say thank you for your forbearance and ahead of that. And with that, if we could, Kathy, thank you for the background. Let's go into the live edit piece. If anybody has comments to make to the live edit piece.
Okay, just take me a second to share my screen with the correct document. Oh no, so I have to exit the view. There we go. Now I can get in.
Don't know why you apologize, because none of us could manage this on any front.
Let's see, there it is. Share. All right, can you now see the Community Engagement Advisory Board language on the screen?
Yep. You could make it a little bit bigger.
I can definitely do that. I cannot see chat, however, so someone else will have to let me know. Nope, that's not working for making it bigger. Here we go.
Yeah, again, I will ask Virgil and others to see hands being raised and that kind of stuff. I will try to monitor folks as well in the chat and on the screen, but I could always use some help in identifying when folks want to talk. Committee members, obviously, if you're unmuted, you can go ahead and talk and we'll be okay. I think we functioned fairly well that way last time as well.
Okay, so for clarity in this document, we didn't do track changes because there was a lot of moving around of text. So what you're seeing is just a clean draft of what the advisory board members suggested. So the beginning for authority is quoting directly from statute here. And then this part is basically identical to what was happening earlier. And then we need a little bit of consolidation for the information about meetings that might look a little bit different than what's in the original draft. What's most important that's changed here is it's stating what quorum is, and it's making it crystal clear that we're like giving the number of people, so no one's confused by what we mean by simple majority. Then what happens, this is where you're going to see more of the substance of the changes. So here we're going back to statute to clarify what the responsibility of this advisory board is. The idea that you're making formal recommendations about that community engagement framework. And then this is the process by which advisory board members are bringing forward their proposals. So basically, they have to fill out a form that clarifies what it is that they think needs to be addressed and who's going to benefit from it. So this is a well thought out idea. And that this has to be submitted in advance of the meeting and posted. And then the advisory board members are rank ordering all the possible things that could be brought forward as a formal recommendation. The top 3 would be discussed in the meeting. People determine if they want to go forward with it. And if so, that kicks things over to the office for a feasibility study. And again, this is quoting directly from statute again, because that's set up that if there's going to be recommendations coming from the advisory boards, that first the office is going through and really making sure that that's a reasonable, like everybody understands what the recommendation would mean. And then when that comes back, there is a vote by advisory board members using the same voting scale that's used by the governing board currently. And then basically that this then get anything that people want to go forward with then goes to the governing board. So that's the process that's specific for community engagement. So are there any edits or suggestions or concerns based on this first one before we go to data and tools?
Comments? I'm scanning. I'm scanning. I see no hands. All right, seeing no hands, obviously knowing that we're going to have another conversation about this in front of the full board itself, but in case there are sort of clarifications that folks figure out afterwards, I don't want to say that there are no off ramps or on ramps, but that will be a possibility. Let's go ahead, and the next step in this process, if I'm not mistaken, is open it up for public comment to see if there are any.
Let's just talk about data and tools, because there are some slight variations.
Oh, sorry, go for it. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
I was moving too fast for you. I apologize.
No worries. So again, authority, quoting directly from statute. This again is looking basically the same as it did before. Everything here is completely parallel construction to what we saw for the Community Engagement Advisory Board. Here again, we've got clarity about what it is they're giving general recommendations on. That's derived from what's in statute. And then they actually, as I mentioned earlier, have an opportunity to bring forward multiple proposals, but they have to go through a process where they're filling out a form. So here you see that there's slight differences to the forms based on those 3 different topics that they can provide input on. So you've got this idea of what's happening with the data request process. You've got changes to tools, and then you've got changes to data points. One of the things that's really important about the recommendation about data points is that there was great concern on the advisory board that they wouldn't want to ask for something that was already there or wasn't feasible. There was an understanding that data points are a highly technical topic. So what they requested is that in those cases, there would be a public meeting where representatives from any entities that might be providing those data could come and talk to advisory board members. So that would happen before they would ever even bring a formal request forward. And again, this was an idea that came out of the advisory board, out of their concern about having adequate understanding of data points before requesting them. And then the process follows the exact same cadence as community engagement, where there's a standard time in bringing forward formal proposals, rank ordering by advisory board members, discussion, votes, feasibility study by the office, further discussion in the spring, and then it goes to the governing board if people approve. Any questions or comments or edits about the data and tools?
Comment or construct or on the construct?
Kathy, can you scroll back up again to the previous set of bullets?
Which one? Do you want me to keep going?
The changes to data points.
There we go.
How does this tie into the data point or the P20 expansion process that we're also talking about, these particular bullets?
So this would feed the second scenario, which is where there's a request coming from the advisory board for an expansion of the P20W data set.
Something that I might find helpful, generally speaking, and thinking about one of the comments that was made in public comment at our last meeting, like what exactly do we mean by data point? We use that term a lot, but it may mean different things to different people. And I just want to make sure that people understand we're talking about the same thing. Data point as distinguished from like a data product. Like we want something that it addresses this question or something. That's not a data point. Like a data point is a very specific thing. So it would help if there was like an example or a criteria or something, because this group is charged with both data points and with data products, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what is the difference between those two things?
Well, a tool is probably what you're thinking about for data products. What I'm wondering is if AB 132 defines data points, because there were definitely definitions in the legislation, and it was because the legislation gives the board responsibility for potentially expanding the number of data points. I would just want to make sure we're consistent. let's see, I'm worried about trying to do too much on my screen.
So like, for example, like financial aid data is something that, was discussed a lot, but is still kind of up in the air in terms of what its status is for being included in Cradle-to-Career.
Mhm.
That I could see that as being something, potentially that this group might take up and is like, oh, we want more, student loan debt data or something like that. That's not a data point. That's like a family of data points. A data point is like, we want to know if this is a federal direct loan or a Perkins loan. Like that's a data point. So, at what level are we going to do like an entire proposal on something?
So according to what's been laid out in this process, let's just talk about the fact that most people who are looking for information have no idea about how the underlying data is structured. So they're like, the loan stuff. And someone who's in financial aid would be like, oh, are you looking for this technical thing or this other thing or this other type of loan? And generally the idea is that if you were filling out the form, like you wanted to do that, you'd have to have a meeting where you're like, I want loan stuff. And you'd have a conversation with maybe someone from CSAC, maybe someone who works on financial aid from, some of the post-secondary institutions. And you'd have a conversation where they would think about what that would actually mean. So let's say the person is only able to get detailed enough to say, I want as much information about federal loans as possible, something like that. And I want that because we're trying to figure out total cost of college and those types of things. Then the next step is the feasibility study that the office does. So that at that point, the office would be tasked with figuring out what are the available data points, what are the federal statutes that might make it difficult for entities to share those data points. So I think that would kind of get fleshed out in the feasibility study. But I'm extrapolating from my own knowledge. And what's important is this manual is there to inform people who may or may not understand how data are structured. So do you think it would be helpful to have a footnote at this point where we define what a data point is?
I would find it helpful.
Okay. What I'm
just one question. Do we think that we could have universal agreement amongst us all about what a data point is?
Or at least some,
because you make a great point, Chris.
yeah, I mean, I wouldn't expect us to hash out a specific definition, but at least some criteria for what we're talking about.
Mm-hmm.
So my suggestion is that we take a little bit of time and we go back and look at the statute, because there is reference there. I don't know, Beth, can you pull up AB 132, or Marianne, do you have it handy?
Yeah, so just looking quickly at the section of AB 132 that has the definitions, which is 10.861. Data points is not one of the defined terms.
Okay.
P20W data set is, and it talks about, specific numbers of data, approximate numbers of data points that different data providers will share. So there's a definition of the P20W data set overall, but not a specific definition of a data point.
Mm-hmm.
I think to what Chris was mentioning that we could cut and paste. There is a definition of operational tools and analytical tools that do make it clear that those are kind of things, tools and resources that are used as opposed to the data set from the P20W data set.
Okay. So do you want to try to come up with a definition right now? So what I'm cognizant of is that you can have a data point like enrollment. You can have a metric, which is a formula, like the number of students who completed transfer level math and English in the first year of enrollment within the same, district, which is a data point that gets referenced in, or people think of it as a data point, but it's actually a formula. So people from the public might not know what is a data element, which is a singular thing, and what is a metric that is a formula. So do we want to go so far as to say that.
Well, I guess I'm thinking in terms of like a feasibility study, and it's hard to imagine an entire feasibility being conducted over some like super specific granular little data point, and the end result is either a yes, no, like we can't do it. You know, I was imagining something more like what you described. It's like, oh, we want more information generally on student loan debt. So
the issue is that
there would be probably multiple data points around it that would, you know, in the feasibility study would address what is available. But I mean, I'm just sort of thinking out loud here because I realized that I wasn't quite sure what we meant by data point.
Chris, if I may add a little bit of context from the advisory board conversation, because I think it's in the spirit of what you're mentioning. What the advisory board, ad hoc committee of the advisory boards mentioned in December was a desire on their end to not go into this process without the right amount of context. So I'm wondering, Kathy, could you scroll to the part that says 2 months before the advisory board meeting? It's at the bottom of the list of bullet points that Chris was just referencing.
There it is.
There we go. So I'm wondering if perhaps one way to address Chris's point here is that we add, if you wanted to, a half sentence here, because the purpose of that meeting, I think, is an opportunity for advisory board members to have conversations with data providers about exactly this, right? I'd love to have more information about financial aid. What kinds of data are already collected at the state level? And there's this element, this one. Great, now I understand that more. And so maybe would it help to add a sentence here that essentially says, part of this purpose of this meeting would be to help share information about what data elements and specific data points, you know, may already be collected, or maybe, could just something about like that nuance, that part of the point of that conversation may be to disentangle some of the confusion that may exist, especially if one isn't already kind of embedded in the data world of a particular subject area or policy area.
Okay, that makes sense.
Does that sentence work for you?
Clarity as opposed to, like, I'm not sure the definition of a data point will result in that clarity in a way that a conversation might.
Yeah, that's fine. Just like some sort of shared understanding of what we're talking about.
I'm gonna not use data points twice. Okay,
Right, thank you.
Does this give you the enough to address that, or have I focused the attention on the wrong place?
I would strike metrics unless you have information that leads you to believe that, I mean, it's just complicated that people can read into that, and sorry for the sirens.
So maybe
metrics can imply analysis and depth of, what beyond what we can provide potentially.
And maybe they just take data elements out, just data that are managed by data providers.
Does that work?
Or is it clarifying information?
I mean, something like source data, like only available through data providers, something like that.
Are they called data providers throughout the document? I think they are, because I think we dropped partner entity. I think that was a planning phrase.
I wonder if source data might be too jargony.
Yeah.
We're just trying to,
Agreed.
if I understand, the intent is to explain what we mean by information, and data, for better or worse, can be a catch-all of like a subset of this data set and these points from one data set plus this data set aggregated, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't think we necessarily need to spell out things like whether it's sourced or verified, et cetera, at this juncture.
Yeah, I agree with that. I guess I was just
It's-
trying to communicate something where it's like, this is something we can only get from this data provider, therefore we have to go through this process, as opposed to something like, oh, it would be great if you could, collect this for us. It would just be the easiest way for you to get it to us, even though it might be possible through some other process. Okay. Sorry for the diversion, but thanks for indulging me.
No.
That's not a diversion. That's the purpose of your input. Okay. I just noted that.
Not a diversion. Thank you. Good. Again, open it up to the floor. Any of the other committee members have comments or questions? And thank you, Marianne, for the suggestion about how to locate that and what to say.
I had one question about
Go ahead,
this
Jerry.
particular piece. And that is, for the heading on there, it says changes to data points, but basically what we're talking about is adding data points. Do we also somewhere in here talk about dropping or deprecating data points no longer needed, that sort of thing?
I believe statute gives the governing board the authority to remove or reassign who's adding data points, and gives the data providers authority to adjust the way they deliver a concept in a data point. So this is really specific to what the advisory board could bring forward, which is in essence a suggestion with emphasis, because it's ultimately up to the data. It's always up to the data provider whether they provide the data or not per statute. But I do see why with the word changes is maybe not the right one. Is there a different verb that you think would be more effective? Or it's not really a verb in that case. A different word.
I can't think of one at the moment. It's just that one kind of stuck out for me.
Would adjustments be better? Like if it became for adjustments to, and again, for clarity, P20W set, P20W data set, data points. Well, all this language assumes in addition.
Yeah. Well, so let's go back to our original assumption. If it was data removal, or if it was a point removal, it actually wouldn't come up through a suggestion process to change a process necessarily, would it? I mean, I would assume that the providers themselves in their ongoing processes would say, this is an obsolete data point that we're not using for anything else. Would we mind if we not use it anymore? And might not become part of this process.
So those suggestions would not need to go through the Data and Tools Advisory Board. Is that what you're saying?
That in itself is a great question.
So I'm going to bring up a case that I'm aware of. So when there were changes made for the community colleges that made the concept of passing a transfer level math course very high stakes, some of the faculty realized the way that formula was constructed was not capturing some of the transfer level math courses. And so there was pressure that was put then on the chancellor's office to adjust the definition so that it would capture a different type of math class. I could envision a scenario where, especially when we're constructing metrics that are working across agencies, that someone in the field would realize that methodologically there might be a different way to do something, and that they would come forward and say, could you make an adjustment to this calculation to address this shift? So now, I mean, when it's something that's specific to one agency, that process should go like that example that I'm giving is a community college specific example, but maybe there would be something that would be a calculation across multiple data sets that we would be looking at.
Do we talk about this anywhere else in the governance manual? Sort of rather than adjustments, sort of additions and deletions?
Yeah, I'm wondering if it wouldn't be helpful to look at the governance manual under the section called approving data points. There's a little bit more language in that section.
Okay.
And it does talk about adding and removing requested data points.
Right. I'm going to stop the share and I'll go to the actual manual. It's not it.
Which brings up another question of, is this more policy or is this governance?
Well, according to the first paragraph of the governance manual, it says this is where you describe authority, policies, and procedures. So I think policy sort of goes into the governance manual for the purpose that's laid out in the beginning.
And to say it a slightly different way, I think the governance manual is how we agree to operate in adjusting all of our policies and operating and setting the policies and interpreting policies. It's not a policy document itself, but it governs how we do the policy of the work.
Let's see, I'm trying to get to the table of contents. There we go. And approving data points is page 29. Let's see. Okay, so where would you like to go in this document, Amy?
Second paragraph there, the participation agreement, that one.
Mm-hmm.
It talks about the governing board may add or remove requested data points.
Actually, doesn't that govern exactly what we were talking about, Chris? And Jerry? Thank you, Amy.
Which part?
Well, so if I recall correctly, Jerry's concern was that we were speaking in the previous document about what happens if we want to get rid of an element, and where were we speaking to that? And I think we're speaking to that here in this second sentence. Second sentence.
Yeah.
So that we can, I mean, at least from my perspective, we can sort of continue to have the language that says change in the other section, so long as we have this to fall back on.
Modify seems like a good verb there.
I like that too.
This is actually quoting directly from the participation agreement, so I don't think I can put that.
That's perfect. No, right. Anytime we can festoon against the legislation or the participation agreements, we should festoon against that. Absolutely. Thank you. Jerry, does that alleviate your concerns?
Yeah, that helps, definitely.
Thank you.
I would just clarify that this language here is much more clear because it says the data elements provided may be modified. Whereas if you shorten it and you don't have the provided or what's available, you could interpret it as actually like changing the data. Like it's not 50, it's 36. So perhaps we go back to this language just for consistency.
So,
Yeah. Go ahead.
no, go ahead. Meredith, are you saying going back to the advisory board governance document that we use that wording?
What we have here is a lot more clear because it says the data elements provided or the data elements available.
Okay.
What's on the shelf is
Yeah.
what's
I
modified
like
versus
that.
dual,
Yep.
like, you
Yep.
know, data.
So then going back, okay, sorry. Here we go. I'm gonna go back to here, and then I'm gonna go back to here. Sorry. So for adjustments to the P29 data set data points, so this is where we need to fix the
Available
language.
or provided.
To the data points provided for the P20W data set. Does that work better? So one
Works
of
for
the things
me.
that I do want to flag,
Modification,
modifications, sure.
Yep.
One of the things I just want to name is that there will be a point where this process is going to trigger a desire for data points that you don't have. And I'm just going to go take a flyer here, and I'm going to guess that juvenile justice is going to show up in the first 4 years of the existence of this advisory board, just because that's what showed up in a lot of other states. That's not in the enormously expansive California proposed data set. So just to be aware that this process is probably going to go above and beyond what's in the existing participation agreement, and then that will be a different process. But I don't want to call that like invite that right now. So this at least makes a lot of clarity about how you would begin to adjust any of those modifications.
Any other comment? Oh, Marianne, you have raised your hand.
Just a language observation. If I read for modifications to data points, I would interpret that as there's a fixed number of data points, and this is about recommendations to change that fixed number of data points. Does that reading, will people understand that this could also include suggesting additional data points? Which is, this started out as additions. I think we've modified it a couple times. Perhaps the first bullet point clarifies that, but I just wanted to share that observation, that modifications to data points provided might sound like changing the
The
existing.
points themselves. No, I understand.
That's what I was trying to avoid. How do people feel about available, or like what data points are available? Just to
Say more. How would you craft that line?
I guess, yeah, for modifications to what data points are available, or the availability of, I don't know. Marianne, I hear you, and I was struggling with that, with how it was before. I was reading into, like, someone could read into that and think that it's this limited case.
I still read it the same. How about data points not available through the P20W datasets for data points not available? Removing the word modifications altogether.
Oh, I see what you're saying.
Then we want to take out or changed.
No, because I think to sort of several points earlier, that might be an outcome that we need. I would be comfortable with this language. Others?
And when it says proposals may be submitted, I know we don't have the form we're talking about here yet, but is the proposal made to a specific data provider or C2C in general?
What they proposed is that the proposal has to address these questions. This becomes sort of the outline for the form. And those forms filled out are reviewed by members of the advisory board who are rank ordering the ones they think that are important. And then they're discussing the top 3. So then they're determining how many of those go forward to the feasibility study. So there would be an enormous amount of visibility. So the public would be able to see all the forms that were submitted. They'd be able to see what got rank ordered. They'd be able to see all the public comment. And then they'd be able to see the feasibility study when it gets shared at the spring advisory board meeting.
So, I mean, this language here for data points not available, we're essentially talking about expanding and adding new stuff, right? Is that what this is laying out?
It's really up to all of you.
Right, which then gets back to Jerry's point about sort of striking data points. What about sort of modifying something along the lines of modifying the usage of a particular data point? Right, it's not informative. It's not informative in this tool, but it's now informative in this tool. How do we sort of grapple with that? Am I overthinking this?
I think so, because so you've got this other process up here that if you want to make a change to those tools.
That's to the tools themselves, that's true.
Right. So those are separate processes because they're different discussions that you'd have. So if someone wanted to add a dashboard on a new topic, or they want a new type of, tool and service of students, then they'd go through this process.
Yeah, and I would think removal of a data point or deprecation of a data point, as Jerry mentioned, could also go through that top set of bullets as well. Because it's something that's already been provided. Data providers have already signed off on it being used. So getting rid of it or no longer using it shouldn't have to go through this process back to the data providers, I would think. So if in the second part there, it sounds like what we're really talking about is for expansions to the P20 data set.
I think that's probably right.
And that's the only reason why you would have to make a proposal to data providers, is to ask for more data that has not previously been provided or agreed to.
I think that's probably right.
I think the wording is very clear for that use case. For editing or removal, this doesn't cover that case, but as long as there's guidance somewhere else for that, it seems like the expansion would probably be the likeliest input that we would get, right?
We have no other place. This is where you're setting the policy for
Yeah.
how the advisory board provides you with those recommendations.
Well, then it's incomplete as is, without some sort of a preamble or post thing for, I don't want to add a point, but I want to correct some element. There's no way for people to request that because it isn't necessarily correcting a dashboard or a tool. Right?
Right. So you do have this language you added earlier, that the data point should be added or changed, to use the transfer level math example I gave earlier. So what's
Mhm.
not in alignment now is this. Although you could read it that, so in that case, what was missing were statistics classes that were being offered through psychology departments, to get super technical here. And so what wasn't available was the acknowledgement that there were stats classes being offered in psych departments. So that would be information that wasn't available.
And would that need to go through the advisory board, or could it come directly from a provider that says, hey, by the way, we need to provide this?
So technically, in the responsibilities of the office, there's a staffer that goes to every one of the data providers every year and says, hey, have you changed anything in your descriptions of how you're calculating these metrics that we need to know about? So there's and that's why there are positions that are funded within the data providers, because there's this conversation on an ongoing way that's speaking to data quality and validity, because that's one of the core tenets for the data system. So this is just literally when you've got someone on the outside. And I used the example from the community colleges just because that is a case where I happen to know it was the faculty from a couple of colleges that realized this thing was happening and raised it to the attention to the chancellor's office. And the chancellor's office did elect to change the definition in the end, because they agreed that it should change. So we're creating the possibility for that kind of constructive feedback with this process, if you want to have stuff about changing data points as well. So you could say things like, or adjustments to those data points. So here you are making clear, we're talking about adding stuff, adjusting stuff. I don't know if deleting data points is going to be important or not, but we could add something to it.
Instead of those, what if we put existing or available?
Does that look right?
I actually think it allows us, right, it allows, that language would allow for deletion, at least as I read it.
Yeah, I'm good with this too.
We're adjusting this data point not to consider it anymore. Okay. Is that good with folks?
Yeah,
And just so I understand this, the form would have to be filled out, reviewed, etc. And then 2 months before the meeting, the office will convene.
So
meeting.
this is clarifying what's in the form. So what they asked for is, you know that in September, you're going to have the meeting where you have to put forward the proposal. So you back up 2 months from that. And so you're like, hey, I'm thinking about adding a data point that would capture statistics classes. You get to have a public meeting where the people who know about this can weigh in on it. Then you've got time to finalize your proposal if it looks like a good idea. Everyone can see what your proposal is. Then the advisory board members are voting on it. And the top 3 are being discussed in a public meeting. And then you vote to see which ones go to feasibility study. And then the office has until spring to finish the feasibility study. And recall, the feasibility study is done in close concert with the data providers, so that we're really getting to all that information, which is defined elsewhere, but all the things that have to be in that feasibility study. And then in the spring meeting, the advisory board discusses it and votes on whether to advance it. And then the board considers it. And in no case can anybody force any data provider to provide anything, because that would break the law. The participation agreement says it is up to the data providers to decide what they are going to choose. So if you had a scenario where somehow we got all the way to the feasibility study and everyone said this data just doesn't exist or would be impossible to collect, all that would be in the public record.
There's a suggestion from Beth that says it might read more clearly as quote for adding data points not available or adjusting existing data points.
Thank you, Beth.
Yeah, I like that even better. Okay, I'm scanning at any other comments from folks. I'm cognizant of time, and I know we have a number of things to talk about going forward. So I want to make sure we let folks talk, but also that we move on as quickly as we can. No other comments on this wording? I think we've gotten to a good place. Okay, Kathy, you're comfortable?
Yep, so I think public comment is what's next.
Yep, nope, that's next. Public comments, if you could please resume.
No one has contacted me about public comment yet, but if you would like to, please message me and I can unmute you.
We'll give that a couple of minutes or a minute or a few seconds. Anything?
No, no one has reached out for public comment.
Okay, perfect. Let us then close out on this one and move on to the next of our 3 topics. This one is the additional data points section. If you remember, we talked about at length in the first meeting that we had a number of ideas about editing and did a good amount of editing on the fly. As folks will know from their inboxes yesterday, that we've had some suggestions about edits for that section from CDE. And at this point, I'd love to sort of turn it over to Jerry to talk through some of those suggestions. And then we'll have the same sort of process and discussion going forward.
And many of these suggestions came through our attorney. Basically, I think what we're trying to say is to soften the language a little bit, make it a little more conservative, make it a little more straightforward. And just have a thoughtful approach to adding data points, making sure we're not leading people down the path of as Kathy mentioned earlier and others, that this is just a free-for-all and they can request whatever data points that we have being collected by any of the data providers.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, Kathy, could you make that a little bit bigger, please?
Yes.
Yeah, so just a question or two from me. Part of what governs this for me is the both statute and the legal agreements that are already in place, correct?
This is meant to refer to the statute and the legal agreements, but there was some paraphrasing done,
Okay.
which may not be providing the level of clarity that.
Yeah, that's why because I was reading it and it was a little bit confusing on that instance. Well, I have a couple of ideas, but I want to sort of open it up to folks to see if they have other comments about or questions for Jerry about the suggestions or the request. Okay, seeing none, then I'll just launch in myself.
These are the
Yeah.
edits from Jerry in green here?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yep.
Gavin, I can take one for the team to get the ball rolling if you'd like.
Yeah, let's do it. Go
I
for it.
always like to defer to legal expertise, but one thing that I found that I was questioning, like, how can we ensure that, is that the governing board may not request a data provider collect data that they're not legal allowed. It goes to like intent and how would they know and so forth. So I'm just curious on whether that's feasible. And if the intent is to reduce unnecessary requests and workload, is there another way where we might get to that outcome?
Well, I think that's right. I think, but part of, let me just sort of throw out a suggestion too. I think back when Kathy was mentioning in the previous conversation we had about sort of tying back to statute, I'm wondering if we should not just, in this instance, sort of cut and paste the statute and the governance manual like we have in other places, and just sort of, for clarity's sake, put those words verbatim in the document. Would that make sense?
I think that would make sense, you know, in light of the fact that we want to be very clear about where certain items are coming from. I think that would probably clarify.
So that would mean we would just take this whole section and we would just quote statute here.
Well, it says per legislation. Let's just put the legislation in.
Okay. I can quickly pull that together. This was, I should have put quotation marks about it around, but there is a little bit of ellipses in here that aren't showing. So why don't we just say that I'll go through and replace all this with the actual language from statute quoted verbatim. One thing that I want to note is that CDE did suggest adding one more piece from education code. This is AB 132, which is this thing that I've mentioned, that the data providers are the ones who make the decisions about what gets added or not. And that probably would be really valuable to include up here for really quoting all the relevant parts of statute and the participation agreement.
Okay. Any objection to that by members? Fundamentally though, Jerry, does that fit the spirit and the request in terms of your desires for modifications to this?
I think it does. I think the legislation has some inconsistencies, and we're trying to work through those in the best way we can to move this forward, because it's important to us that it move forward. So putting what's in legislation in here, I think, answers the question, and as Kathy mentioned, adding that last piece for us is very helpful. Okay.
If folks are okay with that, I think it might just be much more clear, as we've done in other places. You just sort of plop it in and have a conversation. I get about legislation being inconsistent, having both made it inconsistent and tried to clarify it in the past. It's tough, but that's a conversation we can't have.
So the next that we're seeing here is that CDE has suggested there's a specific legal review, which is consistent with statute. Are people comfortable with having that addition?
Yeah, I'm totally comfortable. I mean, my presumption had been that any provider's legal teams would be reviewing this regardless, and it would be inconceivable to me that they would have a conversation without it. So that's just clarification of the obvious to me, at least.
So this is a fairly substantive edit, which is the idea of removing consultation with local entities if a request is being made to get a data point that is not currently captured by the state level. So this, if you could imagine a scenario, I'm going to go back to a community college example. There was a point at which it was felt by a lot of practitioners that it would be useful to gather a data point on work-based learning. And so that data point got added, but there wasn't a lot of consultation with community colleges, who then expressed a lot of confusion about how they were supposed to capture the data element, and some concerns about their ability to capture it with validity, because often that stuff was happening outside of the purview of sort of the oversight of the college. So this language had been intended that you would go in that case, you would have talked to the community colleges before you went ahead and created that data point. But what CDE has done here is removed that part of the process. So you would just be consulting with the state agency, not with the local entities that generate the data that go to the state agency. Jerry, did I get that right?
Yeah, I'm going to sort of put you on the hook on this one, Jerry. to talk through a little bit the department's thinking about this one, please.
It's basically based, if you look at the previous bullet, it talks about the feasibility to provide the data point. If we're adding another, the second bullet on top of that, as Kathy mentioned, it's an authority issue. And I'm not sure I have the legal background to probably, answer the questions that our attorney could.
Got it. So let me see if I can tease it out a little bit. Is your issue that it's a standalone bullet as opposed to a subsumed bullet in the previous?
Exactly. It's already covered, basically.
I'm not sure I see it.
This is specifically a process of consulting with local entities in addition to
Yeah.
the agency.
So is the concern here, Jerry, that CD would have to consult with every LEA in terms of the collection of a new data point,
I think
as
the
opposed
concern
to, for instance, UC having to consult with 9 and CSU with 23. So is it a volume issue?
and I think it was more of a CTC consulting with the local entities.
Yeah, I would agree with striking this one as well, because from the very beginning, the data providers with seats on the boards are party to these conversations, and the goal was to avoid an end around going to LEAs or campuses or whatever to try to get something that a data provider itself doesn't want to do.
So I get that point. I get that point as well. I guess sort of where I'm landing is in a place of because this is if I recall correctly, this is a piece that we added in our previous conversation around sort of the necessity of consultation, and what I'm nervous about for C2C writ large is this notion that we're sort of ignoring those who collect the data in many places and not sort of putting them on the hook for sort of don't ask something of us that we weren't consulted about, right? So both from an optics perspective and a perspective of the system and getting people to participate well, it would be hard for me to be okay with sort of slicing locals out of the local entities out of the equation. So is there a way for us to be able to speak to some consultation with the components of all of your data provider systems that are the ones responsible for doing the work of collection of some of these sort of small on the ground data points?
I mean, I would think that, I think what Jerry said was that's all subsumed in the feasibility study. The data provider is doing that consultation and assessing what's available at the locations, what's feasible, what's not feasible, and all of that is part of the outcome of the feasibility study. There doesn't need to be a separate process where after the feasibility study, we go back again and talk to each individual LEA or campus.
Yeah, that's exactly it. Thank you, Chris.
Okay.
I'm reading as part of the feasibility study. So I don't think I didn't read it as a separate, after the feasibility study is done, now there's this additional path.
Yeah, so I mean, it's a possible solution that we subsume this into the previous
Well,
bullet as a sub bullet.
this is prescribing it as part of the feasibility study, that we have to step through this consultation when the data provider might already know, like, no, this is not available, and no, our campuses don't collect it. And, you know, given the language of the participation agreement, that's the final step.
What if you added startup and ongoing costs to the office, the data providers, and local entities?
Yeah, I mean, to your point, I think it's an acknowledgement of the sort of the subset components of where the work takes place. It's a much easier prospect in terms of sort of UC with campuses than it is with CDE and LEAs. I get that complication. Trust me, I get that very deeply. I guess I would be comfortable with that language, and I'm eager to hear from others.
I would support that. That seems to integrate. If we interpret startup and ongoing costs as, you know, costs including time spent and so forth, not just financial assessment of cost.
So that would be the change.
Yeah, I mean, I was originally thinking subservient entities, but that doesn't work in the context of CDE. They're sort of independent entities, LEAs, counties, and such.
How about if we specify and relevant local entities that provide data to the data providers? Because you could conceivably have a local entity to which the requested change or the feasibility study may not apply. So just to be even more specific.
Yeah. Does that give you any comfort, Chris and Jerry?
It seems, I mean, it seems a little bit too specific to me. Like, we're going to have to not only detail costs to data providers, but we have to detail costs to every member, campus, LEA, school, agency, what have you.
It seems a bit prescriptive to me.
So I know that we added another step here where we're going to invite, you know, at 2 months before the recommendation is made, this conversation that's going to be had with the data providers. And could that conversation also include then potential suppliers or others in the ecosystem that could inform the overall recommendation process?
So that would mean going back to here and say advisory board members can learn more about available data points and ask questions of the data providers. But I guess it's a public meeting.
One quick observation is just that the advisory board process is a subset of ways in which additional data points can come in. So we're kind of in a separate section now. We're in the section that's about the governing board's processes.
Right. Good point.
So adding something to the advisory board section wouldn't cover everything here.
Yeah, it doesn't get us there. Thank you for that. Well, what's the will of the group?
rereading that bullet, it seems like the intent is to provide an opportunity for discussion with, is it with the office or discussion with the data provider, or I can see why
Yeah,
people might
No, I
have
think
struck this.
yeah, I think
Even
it's,
though I agree with you, Gavin, on the intent of like incorporating the voice, it's like who is doing what when.
yeah. I mean, ultimately, the desire, if I remember it correctly, was to make sure that there was enough input about implications of a collection of a new data point that might not happen at sort of the governance level of a provider, and that might be happening in the field in some manner, and that voice is necessary in the space. And so, and I get that the point made by both Jerry and Chris about sort of putting the office in between itself and its subservient entities. But so is there some other way to sort of say we want to make sure that we're paying attention to over stressing those who are actually collecting the information on the ground?
Gavin, could it be at some place here we would state with consideration for local
I like that.
entities? You know, it's I don't know exactly where it would belong, but emphasizing the importance of considering or giving some thought around the collection process and the burdens it could potentially pose to those who would be in the position of having to collect it, without being prescriptive about thou shalt do it, or it has to be a particular section in the feasibility study.
Yeah. So check out, Kathy just wrote on the fly. I think she's been pretty artful in the language to say what. So what do folks think about that?
I mean, I think this is all essentially subsumed in the first bullet: data availability, reliability, quality, and validity.
I see what you're saying.
I would agree.
Well, I guess, I mean, the cost issue isn't, but I mean, I see that as more simply captured by availability.
Is this even with that, Chris, is this language objectionable?
I mean, it seems like we're trying to write in a scope expansion here to where we're going to be going out to local entities for data now. And I don't see that as the intention here. I see the intention as working with the data providers that are party to the conversation, members of the board. And, you know, from a practical perspective, what if we engage with local entities and some of them can and some of them can't provide it, and therefore we have partial data? Is that really helpful? Or is it better for the data provider to do that canvassing and get consistency with some data points that they can all provide, and not providing the ones that can't be consistently provided? Why, I don't see why we need to add another layer of complexity of writing in the need to go to the local entities. But I mean, if there has to be something in here for voice purposes, then I think this is fine with consideration.
And I would agree with Chris's first statement. I don't think it's needed in here. I think we've got it covered. And I don't want to get into triggering, you know, state mandates or costs or et cetera for data collection, not in this document.
What if we put with consideration for a diversity of stakeholders or whatnot in the very beginning, where it's advisory board recommendations with consideration for XYZ, are forwarded to the office for a feasibility study. That seems like the advisory board was structured to be able to provide a mechanism for that voice in a more robust manner than maybe the other data provider entities and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
That way it's still part of, you know, the process has a mechanism for input so that Kathy's example and lesson learned,
Right.
you know, is incorporated somehow.
How would we say that?
Well, I mean, I guess one of the things that I'm thinking about, because we were constructing this in portions, with
Yep.
the addition of that idea of the public meeting, that is a place where people could get together,
that's true.
and get feedback. And because this scenario 2 is specifically about when it's coming out of the Data and Tools Advisory Board, we actually may have it covered. So
Okay. All right. I get it. You know, I'm always sort of always cognizant of sort of how it looks, and if we're being as transparent as possible in all of our processes, we may have to revisit this at some point. But at this point, I'm sort of comfortable with moving on and striking the language. Other folks?
I have a couple questions about the bullet where it says offices and the office and representatives from data providers present.
Go ahead.
I mean, do we really mean present or is it submit? Because the final sub bullet of the previous one is they've kind of rendered their decision. And here's all the supporting information. I'm trying to avoid like a overly ponderous process of doing a study and then presenting it, you know, for an avalanche of requests for data points.
I'm cool with that suggestion.
And then I guess my other question is like, if in the previous bullet, if the final step there where it says the determinations on whether it's feasible, if the determination is a clear yes or a no, like what's the process here for determining whether to advance it to the board? Like if the data provider said no, what would happen in a board meeting discussion for if they advance that? Like what would be the purpose of that? Like an FYI, or is it more like trying to compel a different decision or something? I'm not sure what we would be doing with that.
Just for a bit of context, Chris, I believe it would be to comply with the part of the statute where the advisory boards make recommendations to the governing board. So if the advisory boards still want to continue to make a recommendation, that is done in the context of the feasibility study, but it would be up to the advisory boards, you know, what recommendations they want to submit to the governing board. So even if our feasibility study provides information that suggests here's how this particular recommendation may or may not be feasible, the advisory boards would still have the ability to submit that recommendation to the governing board for their consideration.
Right. So if a data provider says, no, this is not feasible for us to provide, but the Data and Tools Advisory Board still thinks it's important to recommend to the board to request it. Is that, so then there's a process for
well, that's what makes the next bullet point edit so important.
okay.
Because it's clarifying that the advisory board can request anything they want per statute. But in the end, the decision is always with the data provider about whether they're going to provide it or not per the participation agreement. So these two things fit together fairly nicely then.
So the data provider could say no, the advisory board still wants to recommend it to the board, and the board could still agree and request it. So we have a request out there and we have a feasibility study that says no. Then what happens? It's just sort of out there.
It just ends because you can't compel the data provider to provide something.
Okay. I guess I don't understand the point of that.
The legislature felt very strongly that there had to be multiple avenues for members of the public to have a loud voice about what happens in the data system. As you recall, they made the process bigger than what came out of the work group recommendations. So I think we're kind of up against statute on this one.
Right, and I think we at the very least owe a larger board discussion of the request as part of the transparency of the process. As uncomfortable as that would be.
Okay. And in the case where the data provider says yes, and the advisory board recommends it, and the board reviews and agrees and says yes.
We're off to the races.
Yeah. Okay, so it's for transparency then.
Yeah. But I like your suggestion as well. Are there, Kathy, I'm sorry, were there other suggestions from CDE in this that I missed in the?
The final thing is just that they've replaced data point with tool, although this is only about adding data points.
Great.
So, that would be a different process. So I don't know whether the desire then is just to strike scenario 3 altogether.
Jerry?
Yeah, I'm not sure on that one.
Do you mind if we revert the language?
I'm just wondering if we need scenario 3. We're saying individuals interested.
If I can provide a bit of context, my recollection from our prior meeting was that this was intended to be a bit of a catch-all. So that our office, if someone has a question about this, we can either direct them and say, actually, this query builder might solve that, or here are the members of the Data and Tools Advisory Board if there's something you'd like to suggest to one of them, or point them to a resource of things that might already exist. So I think the intent of this was just to provide a catch-all mechanism for our office to help point people in the right direction.
Yeah, data point tool. Any other questions? Catch all, that's fine.
Because then I'm going to revert it back to the original language that we're consistently talking about data points in this.
Agree.
Cool. All right. I'm mindful that we have 4 minutes left.
Yeah, I know.
And so
I am mindful as well.
I want to flag something. I made an error when I was helping compile the edits, and there were 3 changes that I got wrong. And I want to make sure that this group has a chance to review what those are and that people are made aware of that to see if they agree. So I'm wondering if we could just quickly look at those and then open it up to public comment.
Let's please do.
Okay. All right. So I got to figure out how to stop sharing my screen and open up the next thing. And I will clarify. Many thanks to Amy Fong, who caught all 3 of these errors. So let me see, can I look at next comment? Okay, one was that, we had agreed that the selection criteria were going to be consistent across the 2 advisory boards, and I neglected to remove the term community engagement within this paragraph.
Okay.
The second one was that we had agreed at the end of the meeting that it was just going to be the board chairs that would be in the meeting with the executive director rather than the entire advisory board.
True.
And so there are two places where that gets referenced, here and then down here, where we fix that. So I just wanted to raise that error for the group.
Thank you. No objections on that, obviously. Okay, shall we open for public comment, please, on that second issue of ours? Anything yet, Raju?
No requests for public comment at this time.
Okay. In the interest of time, I think I'm going to close it down a little bit sooner than I would normally. If the group's okay with it, we'll just move on to the final review of the other edits that were suggested to the sort of the clarification edits that were made to the document at our last meeting, and we discussed that there. Kathy, can you call those up?
They should be being projected right now. So this is what we did is
Perfect.
I took all of the edits except for the 3 that I missed,
Yep.
and put them into this document. So this is just a way to see it all in context. And I guess
Fabulous.
the question would be are there any other things that people noticed as you looked across the entirety of the document?
Open to the group. I'm scanning for hands raised. Okay. Hearing none.
I did have one question. Sorry, Gavin.
Go for it. Go for it.
So as noted in our last meeting, I'm still not on board with limiting the advisory boards to non-providers, which I think is what that last change that Kathy made does. And I guess part of my question is, we have someone on the Data and Tools Advisory Board that is from the CDE. If we put this in place, what happens to this individual?
I'm happy to provide a bit of context if helpful. The board's determination last summer was to provide 1-year terms for the 2 individuals where that was relevant. So this selection criteria language, my understanding from the prior conversations, would be for the process moving forward in calendar year 2023 for the next round of advisory board members who would be selected to start new terms as kind of year 2 of the advisory boards. So this would be about selection criteria moving forward for new members and would not affect those currently on the board, including those with the 1-year term.
Yeah, it was prospective, if my recollection.
That was my understanding as well, because, we were taking a look at the process and how might we improve and clarify some things going forward.
And I still don't agree that we should limit ourselves on that. So I just need a place to voice that concern, I guess.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Do we need public comment on this section as well?
We do.
Okay, let's go for it.
There are currently
Jill?
no requests for public comment at this time.
No requests. Okay, marvelous. We're a little bit over time, but if folks will bear with me, we have the main issues complete that we had attempted to do. So I think that's marvelous. The the question is process, and we have generally operated under a consensus process. I sort of, the parliamentarian in me sort of always wants to have a vote to send things forward, but I also think that we've operated mostly on a consensus process throughout this. And if folks are comfortable with it, I think I would be okay if given permission to sort of take this forward to the full board as sort of a consensus document from this committee, knowing, of course, that we have outlets at the board to continue the revision process as necessary, and that you will all have a device or time between now and the 30th to be able to take it back to your folks and have the appropriate review, and as well as others who have not participated in this process, in order to have them review if that's review that process. So if folks are comfortable with that, I'm comfortable with it as well. Not sort of having a formal let's approve and send forward, but let's granted the committee's forbearance, presented as a document that we came up with together and with largely with consensus. Are folks comfortable with that?
I'm good
Okay.
with that, Gavin.
Yes.
Thank you. In my mind, silence is assent. So,
Yes.
so thank you for your silence.
That works.
All right. I appreciate that. And I appreciate everybody's hard work and reading through and reading back through and really valuable suggestions as we have done this on the fly and as we have done this sort of with short notice and drafts flying back and forth. So I appreciate everyone's diligence in this process, especially sharing it internally and having the right consultations with your folks. And I look forward to the next set of conversations when we are all fully in front of the rest of our colleagues on the board. So if there are no other comments for the good of the order.
Just thank you all for iterating and considering all the feedback and ideas, and appreciate it.
I agree.
Thank you.
I second that emotion. Absolutely right. All right. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
We are
Thanks, all.
adjourned.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kathy and Marianne and everyone on the team.
Thank you.
Thank you.
See you guys.